Hello everybody, it's Anna here with your weekly dose of Middlegame strategy. This is my Strategy's Middlegame show. Today I don't look like a ghost, I just have a new hairstyle. And still it's not perfect, but I hope that you can see me and most importantly hear me very well. So let me know in the chat if I improved my tech skills since last week. Once again, the topic is the Octopus Night. We will briefly review some of the games that we have seen, basically both of the games that we have seen. And also, of course, I wanted to mention, since many of you have requested the Karpov-Kasparov game, of course everybody should know the Karpov-Kasparov game from 1985, which Kasparov wins at the World Championship match and then he claims his title. That is the classical Octopus Night, that everybody must know that game. But I'm not here to teach you that game. I think that game has been covered by so many instructive commentators, streamers, and Garry Kasparov himself. So please go to YouTube after my show, not right now, and find the game Karpov-Kasparov from 1985, Octopus Night, commentated by Garry Kasparov himself. So that is the best way you can learn that game. Don't expect me to teach it when you can learn it from the world champion himself, the legendary Garry Kasparov. So that is the most famous Octopus Night game, and we will see not that one, neither famous ones. You know that I like to pick games that you don't know, because I want you to think, I want you to guess the moves, and so that if you need to find the plans and the correct moves, I think that's when you learn. That's why most of the games that I select are not famous. So, what did we see last week? Maybe some of you remember if you were here. By the way, it's not on YouTube because I was so clumsy with the technical issues that I think it was just not watchable for a YouTube upload. So that's why it's not on YouTube. Now, Octopus Night number 2 should be okay. Let me check in the chat if you guys have told me that it's alright today. Do you hear me? Do you see me well? Do you see the chessboard? Let me see that. I don't see any comments on that. I hope that means that there's no trouble. So let's bring up the games that I was mentioning last week. We have seen a game by, let me open it. One of the games was a really old one. You know that I like old games. So that was a game by former world champion Alekhine, or Alechin, or Aryochin. I told you that his surname has so many different pronunciations, I don't know which one to stick to. Let's say Alekhine. So in Alechin's game, we saw that many times in the Sicilian, you can build an Octopus Knight because the d6 square is weak, and that's where the Octopus Knight is normally. So things went very wrong early on in this game. After knight b5, the correct move was bishop takes e3. You can analyze that. The trouble is that black went knight e5 here, which is already a pretty bad move, and it will cause a disaster after queen takes c5. Now we don't jump to d6 immediately, and this is important to remember from last week. If you are new here, then just pay attention now. Knight d6, this is where we are heading to. That's the Octopus Knight, a knight on d6 or on d3. That's the most typical Octopus Knight. But you don't just want to jump there just for the sake of having an Octopus Knight. After knight d6 check, yes, you have ruined the opponent's king's castling. But the king is not too bad on e7, and now you have to move your knight again. If you cannot support the Octopus Knight, then don't jump to d6. Now this knight is hanging, you cannot go back. You can go back, but then you just wasted a tempo. So normally you would take on c8, but this position, believe me, is completely fine for black. The king on e7 is actually pretty safe, and you have just helped black develop his pieces. You eliminated the bishop on c8 that had no squares to move to, and you have just brought his rook as well. So bad moves, don't do this. That's why after queen takes c5, knight 1 to c3, normal developing move, and after a6, this was the key moment. If you were here last week, try to remember what was the correct move. If you are new, please try to figure out what's the correct move. You have 3, 2, 1 second, because today we will discuss new games. So the correct move was here, Queen d6, and it's just basically winning strategically. You are not winning material. You are forcing the opponent to take this queen. We don't give once again this check on d6 because of the same reason. So knight d6 once again runs into king e7, and now what you gotta do with this knight? You have to take on c8. Somewhat better than in the previous position, but still, queen d6 is the correct move because after takes, knight takes. Now, this is the moment, this is the key, that you don't have a queen on d1. You can castle queenside, support this knight, and the next moves will be f4 and e5. So this is so important. You build an octopus knight, and then you got to support it. So f4, e5. Many times you will have this e5 pawn supporting your d6 knight, or even a c5 pawn. You will see soon. So remember this. You want to jump to d6 many times in the Sicilian. Of course, not every variation of the Sicilian, but many variations allow this d6 jump. The d6 square will be somewhat weak, and you are aiming to exploit this weakness by building an octopus knight on d6. Just make sure you support it. So this is what we learned from this game, and also many moves later on. Look at this. After knight e8, of course, whenever the opponent wants to trade your octopus knight, then make sure that you replace it with another octopus. So knight 3 to e4, very important move. You want to take back on d6 with another knight. And since it wasn't captured, many moves later, white has also weakened the f6 square, and that meant that after doubling on the d5, bringing all the white pieces are great, and all the black pieces are suffering. And this is actually a moment to just have a look at the position and compare the two armies. White pieces are great, as I said, very active, all are very well placed, and thanks to the d6 knight and this e5 pawn, black's camp is cut into two. I know I said this last week, but I want to emphasize that that's why it's so important that the octopus knight is there on d6. It cuts the position into two. There's no connection between the a8 and the h8 rooks. It's very difficult to develop the c8 bishop. The d7 pawn can never go forward, which means that black is lacking lots of space. So he cannot develop his pieces normally. He is lacking the space. He's very passive, and his pieces are not connected, they are not harmonious. That's all thanks to the octopus on d6. Later on, we even had another octopus on f6. It happens sometimes that you can do this, but normally just aim for the octopus on d6. That's perfectly fine to win the game with that. In this position, in this game, it was even more. You had these two pieces, and anything was bad here already, so black had to resign in this position. He's losing a piece as well, and the d6 knight is still on the board. The other game that we saw was played by 12-year-old Nigel Short with the white pieces at the British Championship in 1977, and that was also Sicilian. Surprise, surprise. We did not see the octopus knight arriving there so quickly. Of course, this e5 move is very important. You are just making sure that black doesn't push his pawn to d6. And many moves later, after weakening the king side, after preventing that your opponent can castle, we reach the position where soon we will be heading towards the d6 square. But as you see, the first stage of the game was simply about preventing that black can castle. It was about getting more space. White has lots of space now, expanding on the queen side, and white has many active pieces while black is suffering with those knights. Look at the knight on b7, the other on c7. Both are super clumsy, so that's why black was trying to maneuver his knight to a more useful square. It takes time, and your king is on e8, so of course he had to try, but Short played very well this game, knight b5, now heading to the d6 square. And an interesting decision by 12-year-old Nigel Short was that he didn't go rook a d1, which is one of the main moves to consider here. Next move can be knight d6 check, and then you can take back with the rook on d6. Instead of this, he decided that he wanted to eliminate the dark squared bishop. in that case, black will not be able to take the knight on d6 when you jump there. So either bishop g5 in this position, a tricky move, you can't take it because of the knight fork on d6, or what he played, bishop g7, ruining the castle. After rook h8 you cannot castle, so now bishop f6, you cannot take it because of the knight fork on d6, and next move he will take on e7 and jump to d6. There goes the octopus, and he won the game a few moves later. So this was also a brilliant game. Remember, it's a 12-year-old playing with the white pieces called Nigel short. What we will see today is once again the octopus knight, but the octopus knight transformed, I call it, because many times the opponent will be able to capture the octopus knight. What happens after the octopus knight is captured? This is our today's topic. So once again, octopus knight, but now we will have this knight only for a few moves. Doesn't matter, you still want to jump to d6. Sicilian, this is a Blackburn Mortimer game. Blackburn, I'm sure you have heard about. Mortimer is also quite a well-known name, not only because of chess, but also because of journalism and playwright. If you want to know about the two players, please Google their names. I'm sure that you will find many interesting facts about these chess players. We are here to care about the middle game, so I'm not going much into detail, neither about the players nor about the opening. We care about this position. Look at this move. Bishop e7, knight takes, and e5. This is what we want. We want to push e5, and many times in order to push e5, you need to capture on c6 first. Which means that bishop e7 was a mistake. So if you notice that bishop e7 is a mistake here, what do you think black had to play in order to prevent knight takes c6 and e5? Just try to now play with the black pieces, and remember that white wants to build an octopus on d6, white wants to control the d6 square. How do you play with black in order to prevent knight takes c6 and e5, the pawn push? Let's give you some time to think. Good job everybody who have said d6. Many times you will have to play d6 with black if you are in positions like this where white wants to capture on c6 and push e5. Actually, that leads to the conclusion that white had the chance to do this instead of castling. So now I will show you a little slower this position. I just wanted to trick you and show you first the game. But as soon as black plays knight f6 in the Sicilian with this setup, pawn on e6. So as soon as he plays knight f6 and after a6, so this exact position, what I'm talking about, you can and you should take on c6 already. Because after knight takes c6, we will basically reach the same as in the game. Black either takes with the b pawn or the d pawn, but in both cases we will be able to push e5 and he will be in trouble. So after d takes, of course, first you can take on d8 and then you push e5. These are positions that are very favorable, very good for white. Now, we don't have time to analyze all these positions, but just remember that in the Sicilian, if your opponent doesn't prevent the idea of taking on c6 and then pushing e5, then you should exploit it. Of course, you cannot do it at an early stage. For instance, in this position, this is still a theoretical position. You cannot just play this. I mean, it's playable, but it's not an advantage. Why is it not an advantage in this position? Because after taking on c6, you want to push e5, gaining a tempo. So you want to push e5 when the knight is on f6. That's the big difference. e5 is just a little weird move here after queen c7. I mean, not weird, but just normal. You are not winning a tempo. You are not having an advantage. This is playable. Black goes d5, and there are some games for this position, but this is a completely different story. What you can do is that you wait until the knight is on f6, and if your opponent doesn't prevent it, so the normal moves are like queen c7, already preventing e5, and this is all theory, but what I want you to understand, without knowing theory, is that with white, at some point you can take on c6 and push e5 with a tempo, and that's what would happen in this position. After taking e5, you are perfectly fine with white, you are having an advantage already. So white castled, black didn't realize that he had to prevent this idea. He could have played d6, he didn't. So now white finally played the idea that I was trying to make you play as well. Remember this idea, you take on c6 and then you push e5 with a tempo. If d takes, this would have been the lesser evil, but this position is not pleasant. e5, and after f4 you support this pawn first, and then you can go knight e4, knight d6, there goes the octopus knight. So this position is very good for white. It's even better if the opponent takes back with the b pawn, because now this d7 pawn will be a backward pawn, and thanks to this pawn we will have a great position, and the opponent the other way around. This pawn on d7 will be just disturbing his pieces. So it would have been better to take back with the d pawn. Now what do? We go e5, of course, that was our plan, and after knight d5, what shall we do? Would you take this knight on d5 or what would you play? I give you just a few seconds because I'm expecting the response very quickly. Well done, that's what I'm expecting from my audience. You guys are great, perfectly, 10 out of 10 in strategy, definitely. At least in this topic, you are already dominating the topic. Of course, you should play knight e4, and that's what you guys have said, so congratulations everybody, knight e4. Of course, we don't want to trade these knights. We go knight e4, and later on we can kick this knight away with c4. So yes, black has also built a nice place for his knight on d5, but this is not an outpost because we can kick the knight away with the push c4. After f5, would you take this pawn with e takes f6, or yeah, what would you do? Would you take this pawn or would you play something else? Let's see. Very quickly. Once again, good job, good job, good job. Yes, knight d6 check, that's what we are aiming for. If you take the pawn with e takes f6, remember, you need that e5 pawn in order to build an octopus. So now, after taking on f6, yes, I believe that white's position is still good. You can still go knight d6, but I would prefer to keep the e5 pawn. So both are good. Maybe e takes f6 is even better. Maybe it depends on your playing style. So you could have taken on f6 too, but in general, just not in this position, but in general, remember that you need the support of a pawn if you want to jump to d6. So perhaps in this position both work. I should correct myself, this is also a good move. But in general, remember that this is the position you are aiming for. Jumping to d6 with the knight and being supported by this e5 pawn or a piece, in this case the pawn. And what we are going to see today is what happens if this is taken. So yeah, we have an octopus, great. But what about bishop takes d6? Now what? We take back. There's no octopus anymore. But there's a pawn on d6. And I like to call this pawn the octopawn. Maybe that word doesn't make any sense. But to me, an octopawn is when there has been an octopus, and when it's eliminated, you replace it with the octopawn. So this pawn on d6 is almost as annoying as the octopus knight, and we will see why. So just look at the position now with this pawn on d6 and try to think for a few seconds why this pawn on d6 is so annoying. What does it do to black's position? You have a few seconds to think about this. In general, no concrete moves, please. Very good job, guys. I will read out some of your comments because you basically summed up why this octopawn is so annoying. So, for instance, Clockrow is saying d7 is stuck forever, so bishop c8 pretty much stuck too. e7 and c7 ultra weak, just basically a pain cutting black in two. Yes, it's true, it's like cutting the position into two. Also, Izoid is saying, yeah, you go c4, c5, strangle the c8 bishop, and you are almost like a piece up. Very good point. The drunken lawyer is also saying that the bishop on c8 is hard to develop, and we take away the c7 and e7 square from the black knight. Mikhail Carson saying that it blocks the black pawn for one thing. Duke Crusher says prevents pawns from advancing, bishop from developing, cramps pawns, weakness on the dark squares, e7 and c7, and so on and so on. You guys are brilliant, so all these comments are great. Shout out to everybody who has written about it. I just can't read out all of them, but shout out to Tadam11 and Brave Sir Robin and Trophy Your Peddler and Karsten124 and Sir Toby. You guys all really contributed to understanding why this octopawn is annoying. So I will just sum up in my words what you guys have said. The octopawn is almost as annoying as the octopus. It's an annoying creature because of many of the same reasons. So as you have said, it cuts the position into two almost in the same way as the knight on d6. Since it is in the center, and it blocks the d7 pawn. The d7 pawn is usually a pawn that black can advance. Now, if this pawn is forever blocked, you can never move this pawn. It means that yes, it's horribly difficult to develop the bishop in a good way. Yes, black can play a5 and bishop a6, but that's not where the bishop would normally want to be. So it limitates very much the possibilities of this bishop. It makes the black development very difficult because of taking away these crucial squares, the e7 and the c7 squares, from the knight, from the queen, from any piece in general. But the main importance is this d7 pawn, that it cannot go forward. And you might think, that's just one little pawn, and who cares that it blocks the pawn? It's in the center. So if this pawn was on a6 and it blocked an a7 pawn, so white pawn on a6, black pawn on a7, that's not a big deal. But if it's in the center, if you block the opponent's pawn in the center with your pawn, it completely makes his position disastrous. Just one pawn on the 6th rank. So let's see this game, why it is such a horrible thing to have an octopawn in your stomach. c4, we kick the knight away from the great square on d5. We could go c5 here, but then the knight comes back. So yes, we will play that in the future for sure, maybe next move, but you are not in a rush because you don't want to allow the knight come back. So b3, great developing move. You want to have a diagonal for your bishop. And after bishop b7, now black wants to play c5 and open the diagonal for his bishop. Will we allow that? What would you play here with the white pieces? Very good job. Now we go c5 because we want to prevent black pushing c5. You can also prevent this move with, for instance, queen d4, but on the long run you will have to play c5. So if now black tries to push c5, let's say rook c8, you probably will still have to play c5. It's true that the move c5 allows the knight to jump back to d5, but that's not the end of the world because that will be his only good piece. So as long as black has only one good piece, you can allow that. But what you should not allow ever is that he manages to activate this guy, the b7 bishop. That's what we are playing against, because look at his pawn structure. All the black pawns are basically on light squares, and that bishop on b7 is completely dead after the move c5. So yes, he can jump back to d5, but the bishop on b7 is like as if it did not exist. You have a piece up as long as this position remains like this, and you will make sure that it remains like this, right? So yes, we go c5, and after a5, you should spot the threat. What does black want and how to prevent it? Time to think about that. Very good job. Shout out to Trollfjord Paddler, shout out to Stelios, also to Brave Sir Robin, all of you guys. You have realized, also the Drunken Lawyer now I see, that Black wants to play Bishop a6. So he plays a5 not to push a4, maybe, but the main threat is Bishop a6, and that's something that you have to prevent, because we said that you should keep this bishop on the board, because that's a very bad piece. So yes, rook e1 is the correct move, the best move, so that when he plays bishop a6, you can meet this move by moving away. Of course, we would not trade this bishop. Bishop f3, we have the pair of bishops, by the way. And also, we don't want to trade because this bishop, yes, it is not as passive as it was before, but it is still shooting just thin air. There's nothing that this bishop is attacking. Look at this diagonal. It's not useful. It's better than on b7 for sure, but it's not a useful diagonal. Your bishops will be a lot better. This bishop on b2. Look at this diagonal. And the other bishop on f3 is also great. It's true that we cannot take on c6, but in general, your bishops are a lot more active. This a6 bishop is not attacking anything, so we will keep it on the board. Always make sure that whenever there's a trade of pieces or an offer to trade, compare the two pieces. Make sure that if you have a better piece, you don't trade it. That's a general advice. I'm sure you know that, but just in case I repeat it. Still, we have this octopawn on the board. So annoying. Yes, Black has managed to develop his bishop, but the octopawn is still there, taking away many crucial squares, supported by a pawn on c5, so we have lots of space. We have also the e5 square. It was also mentioned by one of you guys in the chat, so thanks. That in this d7 pawn is, if the pawn is on d7 and the other pawn, the f pawn, has been moved, it means that the e5 square is actually an outpost. We don't have a knight, that's a pity, but we can use this e5 square for maybe the bishop. Queen b8, queen b2, and after queen b4, rook c1 was played. Of course, you don't want to lose this c5 pawn, so white does everything to protect them. And after queen d2, Black went crazy. He pushed g5, which is basically a losing move. What happens with this move? I mean, yeah, he wants to attack, but what's the disadvantage of this move? Oh. Guys, up to you to tell me in just a few seconds that I give you what's wrong with g5, the main problem. Alright, I think that was enough time for everybody to shout, "Weak king!" Yes, it's a horrible move. I mean, how can you play g5 when you see this bishop on the board? g5 in general is usually not a good move, but when the opponent has a bishop on the long diagonal and you do not have one, what is this g5? It's like a self-suicide basically. So yeah, Black went a little too far, but even if he didn't push g5, this position is a big advantage. I mean, positionally, your position, your position. That sounds bad. So positionally, white is better, much better, because of the octopawn, because of having lots of space, because of having great pieces. On the long run, this position is winning, but not on the spot. You have to be patient in these kind of positions, unless your opponent goes crazy and wants to give you the point immediately with a move like g5. That's what happened in the game, and after g3, now Black is in trouble. He has to go to h6 with the queen, and now h4, collapsing. Everything is collapsing, so he went f4, h takes, queen takes, and now rook e5. Look at that square that we wanted to use. Finally, it is the rook that takes advantage of the weak e5 square. And king g2, what a lovely move, so that you can bring your rook to h1. Suddenly this is all about attacking, so Miss Tactics should take over from here and tell you how to mate the opponent. I will just show you what happened in the game, because it's beautiful. Rook h1, and now he took this knight because it's all forced. He calculated that this is winning because you bring the rook, the other rook, to the 5th rank as well, threatening rook g5, and after h6, queen d4, now you are threatening to move the rook away, and queen h8. This is horrible. F takes g3 was played, but now look at this. Rook e to g5, because it is winning. Check here, another check, and another check, and it's made in 2 moves. Beautiful finish, but the point was the octopus first that arrived on d6, and then the octopawn on d6. I saw some of you were asking me about queen b4, if it wasn't better to play a4 for black. There could have been many different alternatives. I'm not demonstrating the best way both for white and black. Both players could have played in a different way. The point is always the same. This pawn on d6 is extremely strong. And that's what we are going to see in the next game as well. Also a new game by Grunfeld against Paul List. So Grunfeld, of course, needs no introduction, and I'm sure that you have heard his name. If not from anybody else than from Peter Swidler. Nah, I'm just kidding. Everybody knows who Grunfeld was. So here he's playing with the white pieces, so he's not playing his defense. And yeah, we reach a position where black is basically forced to play c6, because if he doesn't, his bishop will be trapped. We are threatening soon with moves like a3 and b4. Yes, you can still take here, but on the long run you will need some space for the bishop. So that's why he plays c6. He wants to have somewhere where he can bring the bishop to. If not, as I told you, it had no space. But this e6 and c6 pawn combination is not very good, because it weakens the d6 square. No, it's not green, it's red. Why can't I call it red? Now, the d6 square is weak after pushing e6 and c6, so you normally don't want to push both of those pawns, even though in the Sicilian it happens, but there the active pieces compensate for the weakness of the square. In this position it's just bad after bishop a5, c5, and when bishop c7, e5. Look at this. Now c5 first, and then now that black could still maybe play d6 or d5, you just make sure that he cannot push his d pawn. e5, e5 pawn, c5 pawn, controlling the d6 square. The d7 pawn will be forever on d7. Yeah, and I think you already see a piece arriving at the d6 square, and that is of course the knight. So black definitely has realized that this is trouble, this is a bad position already, but he wants to prevent your idea of jumping to d6, or knight e4, knight d6, or knight c4, knight d6. Therefore he plays b6. Now you know what we are playing for. We want to have an octopus on d6, but you should do something about this b takes c5 threat first. How to react to this move? Think about that. I can't open it. Woohoo! Am I still? I hope that this is still working, because it doesn't let me open it. Yeah, time to think. Alright, I feel like I should hand over this lecture to you guys, because you always guess the best move. It is, once again, what you have said. So many of you, b4, correct move, because you want to support this c5 pawn. And you might think that this was an easy move, but guess what? Grunfeld didn't play b4. He went knight e4 because he wants to have an octopus knight, but knight e4 is not the best move. Here, black could have played knight a6. He went f5, but he could have played knight a6, preventing you from jumping to d6. And now you cannot push b4 anymore. That's the problem. So yes, this position is of course still good for white with rook c1. You support the c5 pawn, but black has managed to have some kind of counterplay. Not much, but some counterplay with rook b8. You want to take on c5, open the b5. So this is something. Not much, but something. That's why your move, the move that you guys have suggested, is the best. b4 immediately, and if a5, you just support the pawn with a3. Knight a6, you still defend the pawn, so there's just no way to take advantage of that. And then you play knight e4 or knight c4. Remember, patience is very important. Instead of that, Grunfeld went knight e4, and his opponent didn't realize that he could make things more complicated. He went f5, forcing the knight jump to d6. Look at the octopus! Yes, once again, it can be taken. But what happens if it is taken? Octopawn! You can take it with either with the e-pawn or with the c-pawn. Both are good. It depends on how you want to play. If you want to attack on the king side, on the queen side, if you want to have the e5 square. I would want to have the e5 square, so I would take with the e-pawn. Then I can jump to e5 with my knight. But this just depends on your style. If you prefer c takes, you can play that. Both are great. Both positions are great for white. Look at the black queen side. Horrible. That's just horrible. He can barely develop those pieces, and he's lacking so much space. So that's the octopawn. In this position, black didn't take the knight, so we will have the octopus. Now the octopus. For some time, for sure, knight a6 was played, and after queen a4, we are threatening to win a piece. Knight takes c8. That's the only reason, by the way, to capture this bishop on c8. The only reason can be that you are winning material. Don't ever take this bishop unless you are winning material. So yeah, we are not giving up the octopus unless you win lots of material or you give mate. Knight b8, well, yeah, black was not really having a great game, and of course he is a weaker player than Grunfeld, so it's normal that he got into trouble in just 14 moves. And here you can play anyhow with white. You have lots of space, you have the octopus on the board, you have many active pieces, you can bring the rooks, you can play b4, a3, so many ideas. Grunfeld played rook f to e1, and after queen d8, b4, expanding on the queen side. Remember that when you have lots of space, you can have even more space, so why not expand even further? a3. Of course, this pawn was not hanging, but just in case he will have to move the queen, he supports the pawn. After bishop a6, queen b3. It doesn't really matter what move you play with white, so just make sure that you keep on improving the position and you have patience. Don't think that this position is winning on the spot. Remember, it's winning strategically, but it's not winning on the spot. So you should just keep on improving the pieces, improve the rest of the pieces. Of course, the octopus cannot be improved any further unless you win material with it and you take something. But you can improve the rest of your pieces and you can expand even further. So you can move your pawns and you can maneuver your pieces. Now black could not keep the tension anymore, and he took the octopus. E takes d6, octopawn, and we have the e5 square for the knight. Bishop c4. To bring this bishop to d5 at least, that's something. But after knight e5, bishop d5. Now, in this case you can take this bishop because it was annoying on d5 if you keep it alive. So this is not anymore the c8 bishop that I told you to never take. If black has spent so much time on activating this piece, he has spent 3 moves on bringing it to d5. Now then you can eliminate it because you still have the octopawn and you have this beautiful knight on e5. Yeah, perhaps black wants to come here, but it's right to move. So I give you 3 seconds to tell me what would you do in this position. Very good job, guys. b5. Why? To allow the opponent to exchange our beautiful knight on e5. That's a monster already on e5. So b5, great move. Look at this pawn chain, the octopawn, a knight on e5, now c5 and b5 pawns as well. In the future, we could actually create a passed pawn by playing c6. Not now, of course, don't blunder your octopawn, but in the future, we could create a passed pawn there. So it's great that you have this pawn chain. It's great that you are taking away so much space, and still the octopawn is cutting the position, black's position, into two. The rook on a7 is a horrible piece that will never ever dream about an open file. I mean, perhaps it's dreaming about it, but so far it's just nightmares for this rook on a7, and also for the knight on b8 after b5. You have killed two pieces with this move, b5. These two. I'm coloring in red, I thought. Red. Horrible pieces, basically dead. They are still on the board, but they cannot do anything useful. So it's like having a piece or two pieces up in this position. And that's why it doesn't really matter what black does. Once again, he went crazy. It happens to many players, by the way, that when you have such a passive position, you cannot do anything. Then you try to do something dynamic. Maybe you can try to go for a trick. But if white plays well, this f4 move is nothing. You just give up the pawn. You take it, of course, as white. We are a pawn up. Yeah, it's not the best pawn up in the world. It's a double pawn on the f file. But hey, it's a pawn up and black can still not move his pieces. So after a4, he just brought his rook to the c file, supporting the c5 pawn in the future. You can play c6, remember that. Rook a8. All the black pieces are on the 8th rank, and this is move 25. We have made 25 moves, and black's pieces are still on the back rank. I mean, how bad is that? It's just resignable. Queen g3, but never resign. If you're playing this with black, try to do something. You would need a miracle to save this position with the black pieces, but you should always try. Queen g3 was played, and after rook f5, king h1, black was tired of trying. White is threatening rook g1, threatening mate on g7. You can also then bring the other rook to c1. You can always try to break through with c6, so there are many threats. You are basically playing on both flanks. As white, you are controlling the center, and you can play on both flanks. You have the king side and the queen side, dominance. So it's very reasonable that black resigned here, although I'm teaching that you should never resign. I understand that if Mr. Liszt thought that this position was desperate and he was hopeless, then he decided the best was to resign. You can play this position, you can analyze this game, look for Grunfeld versus Liszt in the Chess24 database, so you can try to make some moves for black and see if you can survive. I tell you, it's going to be very difficult to try to survive this position. So once again, it's because of the octopawn. And our last game is between two very famous players, Portisch versus Larsen, two legendary players, Hungarian versus a Danish legend. Of course, Lajos Portisch is somebody that I know very well. I've met him several times. I played a simul against him when I was a kid. If you listen to my podcast on the Perpetual Chess podcast, then you know the story that I played against him when I was 9.5 and I beat him. So if you want to know the rest of the story, because it was a funny story actually that I think gave me quite some confidence when I was a child. But if you want to know the whole story, then listen to the Perpetual Chess podcast. I think it's episode 14 in which I'm featured, and I talk about many things related to chess, also Chess24 and my other chess related jobs. Make sure that you tune in to the podcast, Perpetual Chess podcast. And here in this position, this is still theory, so we go through it as if it was normal, even though it's not normal for every one of us. For instance, I don't play this either with the white pieces nor with the black, so it looks like now Sicilian, but it started out as an English opening where knight d6, octopus, jump, and now e takes d6. This is still a normal position. I mean, we have seen many model games, four so far, 2 last week, and now we have seen 2 In all those games, whenever we had the octopus, we were winning basically. So it was a huge advantage. Now, yes, we have an octopawn, but this position is still just equal. And the reason is the following. Yes, we have created this d6 pawn, but it's not as annoying as in the other games. And the main reason is this piece. The b7 bishop is not a bad piece. It already has the long diagonal, is developed. There's no pawn on c6 blocking this bishop. Remember, in the other games, many times this piece was just desperate. It was such a bad piece as if it did not even exist. It had no hope to be active. Now the b7 bishop is just a great piece, and therefore the d6 pawn is annoying, but it's not that much annoying as it could be. Now the cool thing about the octopawn is that even when the position is equal by the engine evaluation, it doesn't mean that for human beings this position is equal. Black had to find a move knight h6. What? Yes, knight h6 is the best move in this position according to the engine, and that's the move to keep the position more or less equal. It's somewhat better for white, of course, but the engine says knight h6 and you survive, so you have to calculate bishop takes h6, queen d2, and then white can castle queenside. I love this position for white, even if the engine says that it's just a slight advantage for white. I think for humans, this position, I would always take white here. I don't know what about you, but black's position is still quite desperate, looking at least. With these double H pawns, the king on e8. Will you castle? Because if you castle, you might get into trouble because of the b6 pawn will be weak and your king side. Thanks to the octopawn, moves like king side, castle queen side could be like a suicide after knight a4. It's just you cannot go king c7. That square is taken. So yeah, this is trouble. So I don't know where black will castle. He cannot castle queen side, and you don't want to castle king side. Therefore, I think that this position is just great for white, and this would have been the best continuation according to the engine. Now Larsen, who was of course a very good player, played knight f6, natural developing move, and now the position is already pretty much an advantage for white after knight f6. So this is the normal octopawn situation where even though black's bishop is not suffering, the pawn on d6 is still taking away lots of space and cutting the position into two. As long as you cannot move the d7 pawn, these two factors will be there, lacking space and not being able to develop the pieces as you want. You cannot move the queen, you cannot really bring the rooks to the d and e5 because there are no open files. So this is trouble. Now after bishop e2, normal move, castle, normal move, castle, rook c8, developing moves. White is just playing normal chess, but yes, he has an octopawn. And after queen a4, rook c6. Of course, you don't want to give up the octopawn, so he played queen b4, which protects the d6 pawn and also attacks the b6 pawn. Now, after bishop a8, b3, we are threatening bishop f3 already, so b3 is important. You protect the c4 pawn. Next move, bishop f3, and we win the b6 pawn. Easy chess, isn't it? Queen b8. Now, what would you do here? You can play bishop f3, but black also wants to capture a pawn. How to prevent that? Now, real quick, because this is just a few second question. Good job. Of course, we would never ever give up the octopawn unless it's for winning something. So let's just defend it. Simple chess. Now we are threatening bishop f3. And the bad news for black is that you cannot prevent bishop f3. So don't be in a rush playing bishop f3. When you can play bishop f3, the next move as well, the d6 pawn will not be hanging anymore. And that means that you are winning the b6 pawn. Black played knight b7, attacking the d6 pawn, but doesn't help after bishop f3. He cannot take this pawn, the octopawn. I told you, we can give it up for winning material. So if you are winning an exchange, it's okay to give up the pawn. After bishop f3, of course, black realized that this was not possible. He plays a5, but it doesn't change the story. Retreating with the queen, the rook is still hanging, you still cannot take the d6 pawn without losing material. Black's position is lost, and this is move 20 between two legendary grandmasters. Now, you see how easy Portisch managed to gain an advantage just having the octopawn on the board. This is move 20, and he's winning already. And these are two very strong grandmasters, so it's not that black played bad. He played the normal developing moves, and his position is lost. That's thanks to the octopawn, and before octopawn it was an octopus. So remember that it's very useful to aim to build an octopus, an octopawn on the d6 square. So the rook goes back, you take the pawn, and this position is lost. It doesn't matter what he does, he's a pawn down and his position is still passive. Knight e8 was played, and of course you are not giving up the octopawn. Knight b5. Completely winning position, black can barely move his pieces, and therefore he tried a desperate piece sacrifice. Yeah, but before this knight takes d6 move, just make sure that you look at each and every piece of black. The a8 bishop cannot move. The queen on b8 cannot move. The knight on b7 could move to d8. Oh wow. The rook on c8, horrible. The knight on e8, horrible. The f8 rook cannot move. We are threatening to trap the queen with bishop a7. So yeah, it's completely horrible. Move 22, and black cannot move his pieces, mainly thanks to the octopawn and all the advantage that the octopawn gave us. So yeah, desperate piece sacrifice. He cannot take on b6 because the rook is hanging on c8, and after taking on d6 we are defending the bishop on b6. Of course Larsen did not blunder this, but he had no way to save the game. So he went for this trade, and then queen b7 just a few moves before he resigned. Basically it doesn't matter what happens here. This position is completely lost. Piece down for black. White has centralized the queen, and after bringing also the bishop to the long diagonal and queen b5, of course once the queens are off of the board there's no danger against the king on g2. This was a good moment for black to resign. I would have resigned some moves earlier, but of course it depends on the player. I'm not telling anybody to resign sooner or later. Just make sure that you tried everything. You try to save the game. And yeah, here it was not possible. This game went wrong as early as move 11. So this position was already an advantage for white, even without having the passive c8 bishop. This d6 octopawn, remember, cuts the position into two, takes away lots of space and lots of crucial squares. That's why you always should aim for the d6 square, many times in the Sicilian, but now this was an English opening that I think transposed to the Sicilian. I don't know if move by move we could reach this, but it looks like just a Marotti setup in the Sicilian. So knight d6, if the square is weak, the d6 square is weak, you want to land a knight on that square, and once it is captured, you have an octopawn instead. So this is what we have learned last week and this week, and next week we will have one last session about the octopus, and that will be the case when you don't take back on d6 with a pawn but with a piece. In this position e takes d6 is the good move, but in some cases it won't be the octopawn but a piece that should arrive on the d6 square. That's what we will learn next week, so make sure that you come back on Thursday the Miss Strategy, Miss Tactics Day here on Chess24. I will see you next week. I hope that you enjoyed this session and that you learned about the octopus, the octopawn. And let me know in the chat if you have had any games where you played knight d6 or knight d3, depending on the color. Make sure to check out the Karpov-Kasparov game from 1985, the classical octopus model game analyzed by Garry Kasparov. You can find that video on YouTube, I believe, so make sure that you try to find Garry Kasparov's analysis on the famous octopus knight game that he wins at the 1985 World Chess Championship, where he claims the title and becomes world champion. I will see you guys next week. Have a great weekend.